The Remedial Herstory Project is a nonprofit working to get women's history into the primary and secondary history curriculum. To help us meet our goal, we produce media, lesson plans, and so much more. You can check it out on our website, www.remedialherstory.com. Our project is funded through grants and by patrons, potentially like you.
Thank you to our patrons Jeff, Barbara, Christian, Kent, Jamie, Jenna, Nancy, Megan, Leah, Mark, Nicole, Anne, Sarah, Alicia, Katya, Michelle, Jessica, Laura, and Jackie.
If you would like to join these wonderful people and become a patron, you can head over to patreon.com and become a supporter of the Remedial Herstory Project. You too can help us reform education and allow women to be seen, heard, and complicated.
Hey, Kelsie.
Hey, Brooke.
Want to tell everyone what's happening in today's episode?
Today, we are going to the 100 Years' War to learn about Joan of Arc.
What's up, Joan?
Joni Joan.
Okay.
Hello, and welcome to Remedial Herstory, the other 50%, the podcast that explores what happened to the women in history class. Now, here's your host, Kelsie Brooke Eckert, and her partner in crime, Brooke Neva Sullivan.
In this episode, we are going to be asking the question, was Joan of Arc a heretic?
Oh, ouch.
Yes, I know, right?
I'm curious. What do we know?
Well, there's a lot to be discussed because she is interesting, controversial. She's a saint. And so, and she's interesting because it's hard. Like, she is a woman who has claimed that she had a vision that God wanted her to do things.
I know there's a lot of mythical things that go along with her in addition to her her story. So it's like,
yeah,
what's fact? What's mystery? What's myth?
So Brooke, as a non-history person, per se, although now I feel like you don't deserve that title.
I'm like the understudy to the histories.
Yeah, like you're there. What do you know about Joan of Arc?
I know she's like the OG Banff of the the war, the 100 Years' War, and she went off to fight. There's some battle scene that I feel like she has like this big speech. That's about all I remember of her.
She does. She has many.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's awesome though. Those are accurate things.
Oh, yay!
Yeah.
Understudy. Point one.
No, she. But what I'm so excited because we have Jacqui Nelson, who is a colleague of mine at Plymouth State University.
Cool.
She's a military historian. Hello, women in war. Boom,
hey,
boom, boom.
Jacqui.
So, and Jacqui and I were talking about this before we started recording, but I don't know how many. I mean, we talk about statistics about women in the field of history, and I don't know how many. I mean, 35% of tenured professors in history are women. Okay, so vastly under the about 50% of tenured professors in general are women. So it's about even at the college campuses, which is kind of cool. But then, of course, as we've talked about many times,
like of those who's in history,
of those who's in history,
and then of those who actually covers war.
Yeah. So I was telling Jacqui, I was like, I think that this would be an interesting subset for my research to be like, how many women are actually military historians doing what you're doing.
I know. Does she like have any colleagues that she knows of in the field that are women?
I mean, definitely like, and especially in the field of history and women's history, like, you know who the other women are,
Sure. Okay.
So it's kind of cool, but I want to like look into that more because she's got to be a pretty narrow, like, and she was telling me that there were over a couple hundred people who graduated in military history with their masters.
Okay.
And she was like one of a handful of girls in the program out of a couple hundred that graduated that year.
Wow.
So I was like, whoa. I mean, so that's not generalizable to all military historians, but in her program, that's where, she was at. So pretty fascinating. So fun, interesting story. Jacqui and I actually went to high school together. We graduated the same year.
Stop it.
Yeah.
And now you are both professors
at the same college. So I walked in when I switched jobs this summer. I like walked into the department meeting and I was like, no freaking way.
It's kind of wild, and that you both are history. It makes you think that you had this really robust history program in your high school.
No, we bonded over that too.
Yeah, which is kind of like, you know, it almost opposes our feeling on it. Like, oh, more robust programming. And your guy's like, no, actually, don't robust it. We'll go figure it out ourselves.
Yeah, seriously.
And then we'll be leaders in the field.
Yeah, we had a pretty terrible high school. We talked for a while before we recorded about how terrible the program, the experience was. And it was... Yeah, it was like pretty disappointing. And, you know, especially in like historic research and writing and some of like the skills of being a historian, you know,
that you've acquired along the way, but certainly no one helped you get there.
Yeah, we both were like, we got to college. We're like, what is all of this? So
I feel like that's most students at this point.
Yeah, probably. So anyway, she's amazing. And we talked about Joan of Arc together, and I, similar to you, probably could have given you the bullet points of Joan of Arc. Mm-hmm. She's a young girl. She, you know, has this vision from God that she needs to get England out of France during the 100 Years' War. She does stuff. I think she like goes to battle. I don't know if she's like a mascot or what, but she's
definitely a figure. Rallies others.
Yeah. And then she's captured and they burn her at the stake. And I knew that. So, you know, so it's kind of interesting. What I love about Jacqui, first of all, every student at Plymouth State just raves about her classes. She's like by far the best professor in our department.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. She, you know, in terms of like student love.
The love of the student, which isn't that what you're there for?
Well, they don't love me. I mean, I'm throwing myself under the bus here.
Doubtful. Very doubtful.
But I loved listening to her. I totally understand why students just adore her, because she is a wealth of knowledge.
Yeah, that's great.
I'm so excited for her to introduce herself to our audience.
Yay. Take it away, Jacqui.
I'm Jacqui Nelson. I'm a military historian, and I teach at Plymouth State University with Kelsie. And I specialize mostly in American history. So my focus has predominantly been around the American Revolutionary War, but it sort of spans out. I'm just sort of obsessed with warfare in general. So I have minuscule expertise in a lot of other different facets, but that one's certainly my favorite.
That's awesome. Your master's thesis was on the American Revolution. Yes. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yep. It was on the Trenton and Princeton campaign. So like I was saying to you earlier, that's the crossing of the Delaware. It's this battle that starts on the very morning after Christmas. And it was at this point of the Revolutionary War when it seemed like the revolution was just going to like crumble to pieces. We had just had a series of horrific disasters in New York, and everybody was just sort of at the point that we're like, well, we gave it our all. Like, this is done. This is over with. And Washington and the small army that he had left with him just threw this Hail Mary at the end of the year. And within the span of about a week, they fought twice at Trenton in New Jersey and then at Princeton in New Jersey, fighting against both the Hessians, the Germans, and the British, and just had like these three back-to-back miraculous victories that none of them should have gone the way that they did. But all three of them went perfectly, and it just kind of kept the revolution alive so that it could continue in the coming years.
That's awesome. What a cool topic to learn, like to go into depth on. I feel like living in New England, we're surrounded by, you know, revolutionary sites and, you know, especially driving through New York, they're everywhere, and Vermont, they're everywhere. And so it's cool it's so much of the military aspect, like the war itself, I think is lost on me. And I think it's really cool that you're an expert in that. So
I'm very annoying to travel with for that very reason. I'm just like, do you guys know what happened here? Like, it's just like, I get too overly excited about all of it.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
Well, today we're going to talk about a well-known figure in war, Joan of Arc. And this speaks to the fact that you can be have expertise in the American Revolution, but still touch on something like, medieval France is pretty powerful to speak to your talents and knowledge. So Joan of Arc lives during the 100 Years' War. And I know, because I'm constantly having to remind people that things are getting better, even though we had World War I and World War II in the last century. It was still the least bloodiest century in world history.
Woo!
And the fact that there's a war called the 100 Years' War is pretty wild.
Yeah.
So can you give us some broad context to that war and what brought this whole conflict on to begin with?
Yeah. So Europe in general, sort of their entire history is just abounding with these numerous conflicts over religion, over power, over territory. And sort of the classic frenemies of England and France, they started to have this growing tension in 1066 with William the Conqueror overtaking England and setting up this French monarchy. And so the English still had their own basis of government, had their own monarchy, had their own family line that was taking over. But those royals, both literally the monarchy itself, all the aristocrats, all the nobles, they kind of felt like they had sort of this dual power in England while still having some level of nobility in France too. So there's about 300 years where this becomes like a growing problem, particularly as France likes to have sort of that shared lineage, but they're also kind of like, okay, you rule your stuff over there. We're going to handle the stuff here. And they didn't really like sort of the constantly encroaching English hands. And it finally comes to a head in sort of like the midway through the 1300s when Charles IV, there's going to be a lot of Charleses.
Okay, embracing myself.
Right, not a very creative naming family. Charles IV dies and he doesn't have a male heir. So his daughter, Isabella, claims the throne for her son, Edward. One of the Edwards. I don't know the number associated with him. But Edward, who is ruling in England. So she claims it for him. Oh, sorry, not his daughter, his sister. So his sister claims it for her son, Edward, in England. But she is ignored partially because she is a woman and her claims are not being accepted. But another facet to it is also that is opening the door for more involvement from England, where the French monarchy and political system was kind of trying to cut those ties. So instead, it goes to his cousin. I think it was Philip. So
this is Charles IV's cousin.
Yes.
All right.
So it passes to him
Philip
instead. And we spend about 10 years or so with just like this growing tension between both sides, because both Edward and Philip are like, no, I'm the rightful heir. Like they're just kind of like going at it until finally, I think it's in 1337, I think is when the war finally erupts. And so from there, you have the 100 Years' War. And it's not 100 like consecutive years of fighting.
I always assumed that.
Yeah.
Like, it's really what they're trying to say is it was a long ass war.
Exactly. Right. If you have 100 years of just straight fighting and nobody has gained an advantage by that point, that's a draw.
Yeah.
there is no winning that war. So it was just kind of like punctuated by you would have a couple years of like really intense conflict, and then some sort of like peace treaty, truce, ceasefire would be arranged. Things would cool down for a little while, and then something would exacerbate tensions and it would erupt again. So it just kind of like ebbs and flows through 100 years or so. Joan comes in what historians consider sort of like the last phase of the war. It's sometimes known as the Lancastrian War because that was the English noble family at the time. So she's coming on the scene just after Henry V has had a massive success that is still like picked apart in military colleges now at Agincourt, where he took on a numerically superior French force and just using like strategy and technology on his side was able to overcome them. From there, it's sort of like this succession of English victories. It is like this boulder that is rolling towards France. And a lot of the nobility in France are starting to think that the finish line to this war is coming and it's not going to end in England's favor.
Or in France's favor.
Yes, sorry. Yeah. I'm not going to end in France's favor. So with that increasing tension and with sort of that increasing fear, there's a treaty that is signed in an effort to, bring around one of those pieces so that France can kind of like get their feet back under them, where at this point, we're on Charles VI, and he marries off his daughter to Henry V. As one of those diplomatic marriages. The episode you had recently on Augustus, he talked a lot about how like diplomatic marriages and how they were used to sort of settle tensions between royal families. And that was the case, is that he married off his daughter to Henry V to bring about peace for a little while, but Charles VI only lives for 2 years after that. And when that happens, Henry V claims that as a result of that treaty and this marriage, he has a right to claim the throne for France. But Charles VI already has a male heir. He has, do you want to guess?
Charles?
Charles VII. Yes, nailed it.
Crushing it.
Right. So Charles VII, so he's often referred to as the Dauphin, or which is the French word for prince. He claims, obviously, that throne is his. So the war sort of like re-erupts yet again as these two are sort of battling it out for the crown. And Charles has a lot of French support initially because there is already sort of that growing intent that there is England and there's France. And even though we have all of these like deep-seated connections, we really need to start pushing English influence out. So there's a lot of support in France for Charles initially. And they look on him lovingly as like being the prince, being part of like this royal family, this lineage. But England is again just having like military victory after military victory. And over the next couple years, Charles just loses more and more support. His armies are getting ravaged. The public is not standing behind him quite as much. And he's pretty much pushed back to a point that he only has a small amount of territory that he has like real possession and power over. And it's at that point that Joan is going to come onto the scene.
Okay. So this seems to be a pattern that as men are not succeeding as leaders, women, there's a space.
There's a space
for women to sort of be like, yo,
yeah,
where you at?
Right. And we can definitely see like women throughout the 100 Years' War were totally used as tools, like these diplomatic marriages. You had mothers that were trying to have influence over royal sons. You had, daughters being married off. You had sisters being married off. Like we can definitely see the way that women were like sidelined at the time, which I think is another reason that makes Joan so like, it's just so heroic in this time as she comes out.
Yeah, absolutely. So give me some background on Joan. Like she's young, right?
Young.
Is she wealthy, poor? What's her deal?
Very poor.
Okay.
Peasant family, farming family. There was
random.
Yeah. There was never any indication that she was going to be doing anything other than farming. That's what she was learning as a trade. She was going to be she was 13 when she has her vision from God. So she was 13. She was coming into marrying age. Within a few years, she would have been married off. She would have been having a family of her own. And it was fully expected she was going to continue farming. She was going to be married off to another farmer, and that was going to be her path. She never questioned it. Her family never questioned it. That was just her future.
Can you imagine yourself at 13 thinking about getting married?
Oh my God. Okay. In full fairness, at 13, I was thinking about getting married, but it was to any member of the Backstreet Boys at the time. So I certainly had full visions, I think, but certainly not as ambitious as hers became.
You went Backstreet Boys, huh?
I was Backstreet Boys.
I was
all
an
the way.
NSYNC fan, so
See, well, we're gonna have to fight when this is over.
yeah. Military campaigns will be waged.
Will be waged on behalf of Backstreet Boys and NSYNC.
Hey, Kelsie, I don't think our listeners know about the new upcoming project that we're working on.
Which one?
The video series.
Oh, the video series. That's awesome.
I know, so I thought we could tell them a little bit about what the project is, how it's funded, and what the purpose is.
Well, we are producing a video series, 25 episodes on U.S. history, 25 episodes on world history. And the point of these is to provide teachers who don't know women's history with like a 10-minute video that they could play for their class. So say you're teaching a lesson on the American Revolution. Here's 10 minutes about women in that time period.
Amazing.
And it could be a foundation that you can springboard from and do something really cool on those women.
And these videos are, yes, you, but they are fully scripted. You can look at the scripts. They're nicely edited with some really great content.
Yep. They're vetted by historians, 2 PhDs, at least in history. So, people smarter than me.
But they're going to be free, and they're on YouTube.
And they'll be on YouTube. They also have a comedian from Hollywood who is helping to make them funny. So it's, because I'm like kind of boring.
No, very funny. But that's awesome. So they're really engaging and they're really cool content. So more to come there. So we have those coming out. And those are funded through grants? Through our patrons.
Okay. So their, contributions to us through Patreon are supporting that project. And then we also have a lot of people that have been donating through Instagram, Facebook. We have a Venmo account. You can find us there.
That's awesome.
And they're making those contributions. So yeah, it's an amazing thing. And if this is something that you're like, yes, that's what teachers need, every penny helps because it is a really expensive project. So.
Yeah, totally. And we had a match donor for a while there too, which is really cool. So definitely if you're interested in those, feel free to donate. You can donate right on our website, Instagram, and Venmo.
Yeah.
Which is awesome. Great work. I'm excited to see the rest of those videos.
Oh, Brooke, thanks for your support of the project.
Awesome.
So she's young. She's 13, and she has this vision. What is the vision?
So she's out in the garden, she's working, and she has a vision where 3 saints appear. And they say that not only is she going to be the savior of France, but they're saying that God is giving her the mission that she needs to drive the English out of France, and she needs to make sure that Charles is crowned as the king. And I mean, we have very limited records about her early life. A lot of this comes from her later trial when she was finally captured. But it seems like she never questioned it. She never questioned the validity of it. And of course, plenty of scholars have tried to dissect where this came from. Was it, plenty of people believe that she had a vision from God. Other people think maybe it was hallucinations from any number of ailments that she could have. Sort of the go-to, I feel like a lot for women when they have sort of one of these fantastical things happen is she's making it up. She's making the whole thing up.
She's hysterical.
Right, exactly. So we don't really know specifically and certainly can't prove where this came from, but she seems to have never questioned that it was a vision from God.
Does she? It's so my 13-year-old brain, thinking about not war. Mm-hmm. Why would she care about, you would think she has a lot of things on her mind, like marriage and supporting her family and being a girl on a farm. You would think, why would she be thinking about military campaigns? Are people from her village going off to war and dying? Or, where does that come from?
I mean, undoubtedly, she would have known people involved in the conflict. And for a lot of people in France at the time, they feel a lot of pressure to kind of pick one side or the other. Mm-hmm. So, are you in favor of the English who seem to be gathering up more and more territory, or are you loyal to France? And it's a hard position to be in because you do have the matter of wanting to be loyal to France. It's a very, very deeply religious country as well. So there's also, and this is kind of a constant throughout Christian societies too, that there is sort of like this general notion that you're meant to struggle and you're meant to suffer. And a lot of that is a test of your faith all along. So she would have definitely been surrounded by the war. Her entire village, especially her family, would have been kind of met with those questions of, okay, well, if the English come here, like, which side do we take? Do we take survival and let the English overcome us? Do we remain loyal to France? And for a lot of people who have those religious connections, everything sort of feels as if it's this religious test of, is my decision going to make God happy? You know, like, is this what God wants for me? If it's all a test and you make the wrong decision, you can get punished by God. So for her, she probably has not thought a lot militarily up to this point, but the vision itself becomes one of those tests of God. Like, my faith is being tested. I've seen these saints have told me I am the one who is going to drive England out of France, and I am the one who has to make sure that the prince gets crowned. And if she's just like, I'm not doing that, like, I'm going to keep farming, I'm going to get married, whatever, that's her denying God. And when you do have those really, really like religious roots, you're going to do whatever is going to make God happy. So for her, it seems like she never questioned it. She was just like, okay, like, I have no idea how I'm going to do this, but this is what God needs me to do. We know she immediately took a vow of chastity. And the next thing that we really have on record for her, she kind of like disappears for 3 years. Like, we have like nothing historically on what happens to her from when she has that vision to 3 years later. Her father is trying to marry her off. And we know that she goes to a local court and she convinces them to prevent this from happening because she took a vow of chastity. She's like, I can't be married. Basically, at that point, you're not a nun, but you're like of that level of like, I'm married to God. Like, I can't be married to somebody else. And she wins that case. So she doesn't get married off, but that's the next thing we have of her.
Yeah. Her dad must have been pissed.
Yeah, right. I know. Well, and it's so interesting to think of like how her family probably approached it is her parents are also deeply religious people.
Yeah.
We know her mother is a big supporter of hers because after her trial, her mother like continually lobbies until another trial is done to clear her name long after she's gone, but to clear her name. So we know that her mother at least believes her to some extent, but it's a 13-year-old girl saying on some random Tuesday that 3 saints appeared to her and told her that she's about to win a war and get a new king crowned. And they're like, of course you are. You know, so it's like, right. So, you know, like for him, it's like whether he thinks his daughter's crazy or if he's just like, look, this is what we do here. Like, you need to get married off.
Yeah.
You know, this is the way.
If my choices at 13 were marry some old farmer or take a vow of chastity and believe in fairy saints,
right?
I might go with the fairy saints.
Right. Do I continue to toil away at this farm with some old man husband?
Yeah.
Or do I get to go on this adventure and try to win a war?
Yeah. Why not?
Why not?
So so she has this vision, she takes this vow, she doesn't get married. Right. And what does she do in this conflict?
So
what can a young lady do in this conflict?
It's so funny to look at her because she is, by the time that she's like back on the scene, she's 16, maybe 17 years old. So still very, very young, but by the time that she's like coming back and like in this court to try to push off getting married, she's already started to develop a little bit of a following by that point. So the message is certainly getting around about her being the one that's going to, you know, save France. And I needed to do a little bit more research on this, and I haven't found anything yet. But one of the things that brings so much attention to her throughout this conflict is that there had already been sort of this popular prophecy in France that a maiden was going to arrive in armor, and she was the one that was going to save France. So I don't know where, I haven't found anything to explain where this rumor came from. So I don't know if it starts around Joan, you know, like maybe she's talking to village people and it's starting to spread around, or if this had been older than that and it was just something to give people hope. I don't know. But she's starting to get sort of this following because of people having an attachment to that story. So shortly after she wins the case to not get married, she goes to the captain of a local garrison and she's demanding to be brought to the prince. She wants to go to Charles and she's saying, I want to go to him because God has said that I'm the one who's going to win this war. And that captain's like, of course you are. Like he laughed her away multiple times. And then finally, he agrees to bring her to the prince. And there's a couple different stories as to why. One is that she had started to gain a band of followers, and it was sort of like behooving of that captain to just agree to what that crowd wanted. Another indicated that she was speaking to him, and she started describing this loss at the city of Orleans, which she wouldn't have been able to even know about yet. So it helped to kind of like prove her divinity in a sense, like she clearly has a source of otherworldly information. And then the other version says that she just started to call out his faith, like publicly and loudly, just being like, if you don't believe me that God has come to me and told me to do this, then maybe you don't believe in God enough. And for a very religious country, that's a deep burn.
Yeah,
so
she pulled the God card.
Exactly. So whichever one of those versions is true, she's able to convince him to bring her to the prince. And it's a journey that takes a little more than a week. And in that time, she starts to wear armor. She starts to dress as a soldier. Like she's taking on this part. She cuts her hair short. Like,
armor's expensive. Where does she get that? Does he help her with that at the garrison?
I don't know it off the top of my head, but I could also imagine that it could be coming from those followers too. If they really are believing that this is the girl that's going to save France, they're probably likely to get her just about whatever she needs. So could have come from there. Could have come from the captain. Yeah. I'm not quite sure, but
okay.
But yeah, so she cuts her hair short to look like a man as well. And then she arrives at the palace that the prince is staying in. And the prince has been briefed that she's coming, briefed about her overall message that this is a divine mission and stuff. And so he ends up trying to sort of test her. And he dresses up like one of his courtiers. And he has his courtier dress up like him and sit in his throne.
Classic.
Yep. Fun little game for him. And apparently, like, she comes into the Great Hall and she's already like a spectacle because people are curious about her. Certainly have heard a little bit about her up to this point. And now here's this, at this point, 16, 17-year-old girl in armor, hair cut short, sort of like embodying a soldier. And she struts right in and she beelines right for Charles. And, he plays it up and he goes into a little method acting and he's like, oh, me, I'm just like this humble, courtier. Like, it's the guy up there. That's the one you're looking for. And she just she wouldn't waver. So this already helps to convince him that, sort of like with the captain, like maybe you do have some sort of like otherworldly information. And apparently after that, she talks to him and talks about things that he only said in prayer. So there's no way she could have known about them. So he's convinced that she is part of this holy mission. But a lot of those around him are concerned that it's witchcraft. So she also has to be vetted by like the local clergy to, they question her and they have to check her for purity, which is a nice way of saying they check to make sure that she was still a virgin.
Yeah.
And she passes everything, passes all of their tests. And so Charles is finally convinced that she must have something.
What are the spiritual assessments that you have to undergo to prove that God is talking to you?
Right.
Like, is that like a recite Genesis or like?
I mean, I'm sure they tested her on just sort of like general faith, okay. and things like that. And probably tried to poke holes in her story, but she just didn't waver.
Yeah.
And so finally, like once she passes all of that, Charles is willing to listen to her. And she's like, you have to send me to Orleans, the city that it's tactically important. It's, sort of like socially and culturally significant to France. And it's under siege by the English. And it has been for like 5 months up to that point. She's like, you have to send me there. That's where I have to start. And I have to start pushing the English out. And he gets convinced to the point that he does. He sends her and a number of forces, mostly like her followers. They arrive at the city, and the way that the English had the siege set up, is that every once in a while, like these small gaps could form in their line, but the English could always close them really quickly if they wanted to. So her and her followers are able to get into the city through one of those gaps. And as soon as she gets in, she has an immediate effect on the war because she is seen as a hero the second she walks into the city, which is so interesting because she has never set foot on a battlefield. She has no knowledge of military affairs whatsoever.
Yeah.
But the second she walks in, she is that maiden in armor who people believe has been prophesized to save France. So the second she arrives, they're like, she's here in this city that has been under siege. And I don't know if you've spent any time looking at sieges throughout history, but conditions get pretty horrifying. Like food is always short, clean water is always short. There's that constant anxiety and fear of when like the final assault is going to come. We have a ton of examples of sieges throughout history where people literally starve to death under siege. So there's a ton of anxiety and fear, and morale tanks so quickly for defenders and for civilians. And when she arrives, she is like this instant remedy to all of that, because not only is this maiden now here to save all of us, but she's here in Orleans. So that means like this siege is going to end and like all of this suffering is going to come to a close. Plus, then we have the chance of actually winning the war.
Yeah.
So she completely plays this role, and she goes among the people and she talks to people and she's hugging and she's helping to like disperse food whenever she can. And for the defensive officers that are in Orleans, they're like, good, like that's your job. You do that.
Did she bring reinforcements with her, or
some,
or
but
did she have to kind of slip in to the city?
Yeah,
so
she's not bringing a huge number, but she's bringing some followers.
Okay.
And so for them, they're sort of like, that's your job now. And the truth is that if Joan had done nothing other than that, that's already a huge factor, simply because morale can make or break armies. So, and it certainly can make or break battles. So if she just arrives and it's just that persona that's there, that already is having an effect. It is bringing soldiers up. It's making them more apt to fight. It's making the civilian populace better able to sustain this siege. So already she has an effect. But she spends the first couple days just trying to like force her way into like these tactical meetings of like, okay, well, how are we handling this thing? And the officers there just kept trying to push her away. And the feminist in me is instantly like, come on, you idiot. Like let her in there. But at the same time, again, we have to remember it's a 16, 17-year-old girl.
Yeah, I'm a feminist and I feel like I'd be like, shut up.
Exactly. And, you know, like we have to think about how ingrained the idea was that women don't fight at this time. And like, I can't speak anthropologically as to why that is, but we
At least
had
in have.
Yeah, we certainly have.
The Vikings had other visions, but yeah.
Right. And the Celts before, like there are plenty of examples of women fighting throughout European history. But it's so ingrained at this point of like centuries deep of just men fight, women don't. Women are the weaker sex. They can't handle war. So we have that aspect of their society already. And then it's also a teenager.
Yeah.
So it's like, it's twofold. And like a lot of the people that listen to this are probably like middle school, high school teachers. And you have 16, 17-year-olds trying to tell you what to do all the time.
Yeah,
like,
regularly.
Okay. And yeah, we have some great examples now in a much more progressive society that kids do know what they're talking about a lot of the times. Greta Thunberg, you know, like we have
Crushing
these great, right. We have these great examples, but we also have plenty of examples where teenagers do not know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
So these guys are like, look, you're doing your job. You're making people happy here. That's fine. Like do that.
Be a mascot.
Exactly. But she didn't she did want to help the populace, but that's not what she was there for. She's like, God has put me here for a reason. So she'll finally force her way into those discussions, and she will constantly make these suggestions of certain positions to try to hit. She's constantly encouraging direct action. She's encouraging some, nothing that's like revolutionary in terms of tactics, but certainly like concentrating their efforts into places where the English line might be a little bit weaker. And she's denied constantly. The French are like, we've done that. We've tried that. We've done that. You know, everything is just like, we know what we're doing. You don't know what you're doing. she's persistent enough. And in particular, she gets so much support from the soldiers and from the civilian populace because of what they see her as, is they're finally like, fine, like you can go and attack this one position. And she is not directly in like the leadership position because she doesn't technically know what she's doing. But she's a standard bearer, so you're usually riding towards the front of the line. You're carrying your flag or you're carrying a symbol that people look to and they're like, this is where like the core of our army is. So she has that position, which also means she's going to be in the heat of the battle. And she's the one that has chosen the location. She has people that are going with her that believe in her. And they go and they crack this hole in the English line just in their first day. And because it's Joan that's there and because she has so much civilian support, all of the civilian militias that have been within this city that's under siege, they all come flocking to her. And the next day, they're able to crack an even larger hole into it. Shortly thereafter that, the siege will be lifted. The English will finally have a loss large enough that they have to turn around. That was 9 days after Joan arrived.
What? 9 days?
Yes. 9 days after she arrived.
Persistent little lady.
Exactly. And like, there are plenty of detractors throughout history that want to question how important her role was. And, you know, oh, well, like other strategies were being tried. She's not the one that's actually leading. And between the effect that she had on morale and the fact that she pushed for this attack to happen, regardless of her role specifically in it, it has a massive effect if 5 months into this siege, they were not able to lift it. And then a little over a week later, they are. And she took an arrow to the chest in the process. And I mean, certainly not a deadly one, but, you know, she got wounded in it. So she really was like right in the heart of the battle. And that has a huge effect for people because her surviving the battle, again, being a teenage girl, like in the core of this, surviving, it sort of further cements that idea that she really is this girl that has been prophesized all this time.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's wild. I mean, and she's also a farm girl.
A farm girl. Yeah.
Like I'm trying, like I can imagine myself being very persistent, coming to a meeting and being like, I have opinions, but not opinions on something that like I have no business having an opinion on.
Right. Right. If you put me into like some council on the economy right now, I would be like, I don't know how money works, but here, let me give you some ideas. Like, you know, like I have no idea what's going on, but like this is how much like she believes in herself and how much people believe in her, that like really firmly, like God has put us here for this reason, you know?
Wow. That's really cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's really cool. So she eventually gets captured.
Yes.
And is this in the same siege or is it somewhere else?
No. So after this point, she doesn't feel like she's had an effect, but she's like, I'm nowhere near where I'm supposed to be. Like I have two objectives. I have to get the English out of here and I have to get Charles specifically to the city of Reims, where traditionally that's where he has to be crowned. Mm-hmm. So after this is over, this is a big success. It's like the first turnaround that they've had on the English really in like decades by that point. And so there's like more councils of war, like with Charles after that point, sort of strategizing what our next step is. And she's like, our next step is to go to Reims. And Reims at that point is like in the heart of English held territory. Like the city itself is being held by the Burgundians, which are English allies. And she's just like, no, we go to Reims now. And they're all like, no, we don't. Like there's no getting there. Like they were basically like, yeah, we're eventually going to get to Reims, but it's going to be like this slow pullback of forces. And she was just very, very persistent on it. And a lot of people start to relent because her victory at Orleans did have even some people who were detractors because she's a young girl. Even they were like, there's something otherworldly about this. Like there, you know, God is clearly involved in this if she's able to have the success that she does. Between the success that she's had there and the fact that she's bringing in like thousands of new recruits and volunteers because people are thinking like France might actually turn it around now. So they kind of feel like they have to go whatever direction she's really pushing for because that's what the people are going to want. So they finally start this new campaign in the spring of 1429, I think. They start this new campaign and like she is insistent that they just start making a direct line to Reims, and they go, and it is literally just like this steamroller. Like they just are cruising through. They're having like small victory after small victory. They're having a few big victories over the English, to the point that when they arrive at Reims in June of that year, the Burgundians just open the gates. They don't even fight for the city. They're like, okay, she's yours. So she's able to get Charles to Reims. He gets crowned, and he's the official king in France. So that is part A of her mission, is to get Charles crowned. But as far as she's concerned, the other part of this is getting the English out. And so even when that's done and she has that victory, she's instantly like, okay, we need to press our advantage. So, we have the English on the rollback here, so we need to go for Paris. Like, we need to keep pushing forward. And of course, there are plenty of like military officials who are like, all right, like we've run our army for months now. Like, we can't risk actually having a backslide because we push things too hard, too fast. But you also had a lot of political advisors who are like, okay, yeah, she has been crucial to getting you crowned, Charles, but you also have to be worried about how powerful she is. The people love her. Right now, she's on your side. What happens if the two of you start disagreeing? Do the people take her side, or do they take your side? What if she decides she wants to be queen now? Does she kick you out? Do the people back? So there are a lot of people who are very suspicious about her motives, and certainly about the power that she has over the people. So she does make a strike towards Paris, but Charles is a little bit more hesitant about the forces that he gives her at that point. So they're unsuccessful in Paris. The campaign season ends for the winter, because we're at a time, we go into halftime for the winter, and then we come back. So the next fall, she comes back, and there's a town that is being overrun by the Burgundians. So she is sent there with forces to try to protect that town. That's where she ends up getting captured. The Burgundians will hand her over to the English. That's when she's going to have to go to trial.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's wild. It's interesting. Power. Mm-hmm. Like, can a chick just kick ass and like not question her power? Like,
apparently not.
And it's interesting how much of the story has to do with morale and the effect that she has on people's belief in her, you know, and I think there's so many, I'm taking away life lessons about the importance of like persistence and getting people behind your why and your mission, and a lot of the things that we know to be true, but she just lives that example. That's so
absolutely
powerful.
Absolutely.
Okay, so she's betrayed. Tell me about this.
So I can't remember exactly how the battle goes, but she gets captured by the Burgundians, and given all of her earlier military successes, all of it seems a little bit suspicious. But supposedly her horse rears up, she falls off, and she gets captured. It's hard to tell specifically why that would have happened. I'm certainly not like a horse rearing up. Happens all the time. But it seems hard to explain how she would have gotten captured, because for the most part, she tends to sort of be like in the heart of her command. But I mean, I never have really seen anything that could conclusively say that she was betrayed leading into her capture, but there's certainly a lot of suspicion around it.
Okay. Who do you think is primarily betraying?
So it could really come from any direction, but Charles in particular, for all the work that she does to get him into that position, and for like all of the quite literal faith that she had that he was supposed to be there, he was never a great monarch. He was never really actually great for that position, and he certainly was not faithful to her, because even when she gets captured and goes to trial, he makes no efforts to try to get her, and no efforts to try to secure her safety at all. So it could have trickled down from the very top.
Charles.
Old Charles.
Oh my gosh. So I recall in French class as a maybe middle schooler watching a documentary about her trial. It's pretty horrible.
Yeah.
And she's accused of witchcraft.
Yes.
Classic.
She has 70, I think, like 70 70 charges drawn up against her. And she has several for witchcraft, a few for dressing like a man. And then most of them relate around heresy.
Heresy.
Yes,
Okay.
that she is basically, for lack of a better word, she's lying about her relationship with God. Like she's saying that God is the one that's directing her on all of these things, but she's making that up.
So in my undergrad experience, I wrote a history paper. I got to study at the Library of London and hold, wearing white gloves, newspaper clippings from the 1500s. So we're ahead a little bit in time here.
Yeah.
But I was researching cross-dressing in Elizabethan England.
Wow.
And it's a thing.
Yeah.
And it was illegal
Yeah.
to wear clothing out of your station and for women to wear men's clothing.
An abomination.
Yeah. And they were so worried about a bunch of different things because like how would we possibly know that that's a woman and that's a man if she's wearing pants?
Yep.
And they were so worried about dress.
Right.
And it's hilarious because I haven't worn a dress in, can't tell you, but I think people know that I'm a woman.
Yeah.
I don't know. We'll find out.
Right.
We can just do quizzes on the street.
Exactly. That'll be your newest segment. Am I a woman?
Can you tell? Oh my gosh. So she has 70 charges brought against her. One of them is that she's dressing like a man and she's burned at the stake.
Yes. So
By the English.
by the English. Yeah.
Oh.
So the English, the whole trial is a farce because the English have to find her guilty because it's especially when it comes to the heresy issues, because if she is found to be telling the truth, that God actually directed her to kick the English out of the country and to make sure that Charles is the king, they want to discredit Charles because the English king still wants to be in control. And if they are able to discredit the girl that got him there, then that's a pretty easy path for them to be able to be like, all right, like you're not actually the king. But furthermore, surrounding this issue of religion, if God is actually directing somebody to kick the English out of a country, that shines a pretty bad light on England. And no country of the time wants to think about God not being on their side.
Right.
They are most of them cement their power around the idea of God being on their side.
Yeah.
So if she's telling the truth and God was actually directing her to kick the English out, that means the English have to basically like pull out of this war altogether. They have to pull out of France because they can't make a slight against God.
Yeah.
And certainly it would look wrong for the English clergy who, for the entirety of the 100 Years' War, have been telling them that God wants them to wage this war, that they're supposed to take over France and do it in the name of God. When you find out that on the opposite side, here's this, at this point, 17, 18-year-old girl who is winning a war because God is clearly on her side. So they had to be able to prove that she had been lying the whole time. And they're not capable of getting to her. They kept her in a jail where she was abused, still couldn't get her. They used some of their best legal minds to try to trick her into saying something that they could easily prove as heresy, and they couldn't get it. They finally convince her to recant her story by threatening to burn her alive. And so she recants her story, and then supposedly she's in jail that very night, and the saints appear to her again. And they pretty much like lambast her for choosing to preserve her own life over the truth. So she comes out the next day and she's like, I was lying. Like, I saw them. I had this vision. I was led by God.
Had it again.
I had it again. Like very clearly, this is what I'm supposed to be doing. And if that means you're going to burn me, that means you're going to burn me. And they did. She was 19 years old, and they dragged her out to the town square, and they burned her 3 separate times. They burned her corpse, they burned her corpse again, and then they threw her ashes into the river.
Wow.
Yeah. 19
years old.
Mm-hmm.
What have you accomplished?
By 19? Certainly didn't marry the Backstreet Boy I intended to.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
So part 1 of her mission is to get Charles on the throne. Success.
Right.
Part 2 is to get the English out of France. And she's partially successful in that she like pushes them back a little bit.
Right.
What happens when she dies? Is that sort of the end of the French success, or where does it go from there?
Nope. The French keep on a-rolling and eventually are able to push the English out. That's not the end. Obviously, the English and the French go to war with each other again and again. It's, a multi-year thing, it seems like.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of debate about Joan's influence after that. Like you already mentioned before, she's obviously like canonized. She becomes the patron saint of France. But from that point forward, throughout the remainder of the war, we do start to see a lot more innovative tactics and innovative strategies that we had seen in the battles that Joan had been a part of, but we had not necessarily seen in the war up to that point. So there's not a ton of like concrete evidence that we can say that Joan specifically revolutionized the war specifically, but we do see a lot of things change from the very few years that she's part of the war from that point forward. So it does seem that she had a strategic and a tactical influence, but very, very importantly, she had a like ethical and a moral effect on the war, because she had been that person that for a lot of France, she is like this prophesized figure who is here to save us. And having a boost in morale can be a lot more important than people think it is. Having people develop a reason to fight or a reason for a war to be happening helps them to be able to stomach the heavy losses that come from war, to stomach the sacrifices when you're limited on food, when your land is getting ravaged by armies. When there is like a purpose, like humanitarian, ethical, whatever, it's a lot easier for people to be able to continue that war. And in a lot of ways, Joan became that for a lot of French people.
What spiritual effect does her trial have on the French people? Because to me, if the English have proven that she's burnable 3 times, she's clearly a heretic. And are the French, like, do they waver at that point? Or is it more a rallying point? Like, you killed our girl.
Yeah. I think it's a rallying point for a lot of people. And furthermore, her mom is successful within a couple years or so. Her mom is successful in like ordering a retrial and having her retried and having
in France?
Yeah. Okay. And having her sentence retracted. So the idea of her being a heretic, that is disproven in court. So even though the English, quote unquote, proved it in order to be able to execute her, it later gets removed. Okay. So that helps a lot of people to kind of continue in that faith. But it was also just sort of a thing that, two-faceted here. Again, you have a lot of people who firmly believe that God is always testing you and is always testing your faith. So for some people, believing in Joan in the first place was that test of faith. Is that, sure, it makes no sense for me to think that a teenage girl is going to help us to win a war, but I have to believe in her, because if she is doing this in God's name, I can't look like I'm not supporting God. That'll kind of continue afterwards too. Like, you have to continue to be able to support God and to show that you believe fully with your whole soul. But you also can look at it and be like, there's also no other reason why she should have been as successful as she was. She had no military experience, never had studied a thing about military in her life, but still every battle that she participated in, except for her attempts to try to take Paris, she was successful in. So there's no reason why that should be the case either. And again, like morale and motivation have a lot to do with that. But still, it's easier for people to believe that there was something divine about that than it would be for people to believe that maybe she was a teenager who was just smart enough or had a strategic enough brain that she could look at that situation in Orleans and be like, well, this is probably the weakest part of the line. That's maybe where we should concentrate our efforts. For them, it was far easier to believe like God is the one that pointed her finger and told her where to attack, because that's easier than believing that a woman of the time could have a strategic thought. You know?
Teenagers are also kind of impulsive and like, you know, consequences be damned. Yeah. And I wonder if that's a piece of her ability to do that, you know, just like, I'm not afraid of casualties, you know, like whereas older people are like, we are actually afraid of that. And fun fact.
Right. Well, and that's a thing in war all the time too, is that, you know, like people can be really judgmental of those in leadership, you know, sort of like I said at the beginning where I was instantly, I'm like, yeah, just let Joan make some decisions. Like when you are an officer and a real decision maker in war, it's like you're not playing with tinker toys. Like you're playing with real people's lives. So it's like, you know, and this is not just true of the 100 Years' War, but like in every war that we look at, it's so easy in hindsight to be like, well, why wouldn't you do this? Or why wouldn't you have been bold enough to try that? And it's like, they have to think about those real lives. Like they have to be considerate of that fact.
Yeah. Wow. That's amazing. And to her mom for shaping her daughter's legacy too. Moms are amazing. Yes. I love them. That's awesome. Yeah. Oh, that is so cool. And she's a saint and recognized. And there's so much research and sources available about her. Jacqui, thank you so much for coming on and telling me this story, because I knew bits of it. Yeah. And I learned a lot from you today. Oh, you're such a badass.
No, Joan's a badass.
Yes, that's true.
I am not Joan.
You are a facilitator of her legacy.
I am a facilitator of badassery.
Yes.
I'm going to put that on my business card.
Okay, excellent. Oh, well, thank you so much for being with us today and helping. If I were a middle or high school teacher today listening to this and I wanted to build an inquiry, I am listening, and there's so many things in here, like good questions that come to mind. Yeah. Did she actually have a vision? Right. You know, there seems to be a lot of sources available on that, and at least 2 trials where there are documents teachers could pull from. Yes. It also seems like there's a lot of doubt related to her through the whole story. Yep. So is there a question that comes to mind when you think of that a teacher could look at with students?
I think that it's always positive to look at the issues of gender in the military. So why at the time they would want to keep women out of the service, and particularly looking at Joan and looking at the decisions that she made, the strategies that she tried to employ, why French officials were kind of trying to keep her out of those discussions and out of those decisions. And like we mentioned earlier, there was plenty of reason for them to want to do that, but kind of digging into the cultural aspects as to why would always be good for research.
That sounds amazing. It just seems like there is so much source work available here that if I was teaching European history or world history, in world history, I don't know about other world history teachers, but I always try to stay out of Europe. But this is such an important context, I think, to what the old world looks like and the dynamics in Europe on the precipice of uncovering the new world and the conflicts between England and France that continue into the new world and involve the future United States. So this seems like an important one to touch on, and to talk about the war without talking about Joan seems kind of bizarre. Yeah. So it seems really important to get in.
Yeah. Well, and I think the whole conflict is so key in understanding the relationships between the English and the French, which obviously have a huge effect on the New World. So I think it's valuable to look at the conflict in those contexts, because that will help you to understand that tension in colonization and how different Europeans, but particularly the French and the English, fought over the Caribbean and then fought over North America and all that kind of stuff. But then seeing Joan within the picture is probably beneficial in seeing how much society itself gets wrapped up into these conflicts, because especially when we're looking at wars, we struggle to even look at the independent soldier. We're looking at decision makers and we're looking at strategy and individual battles. But I think she's this great example of how much just these societies, these nations, the people are brought into these conflicts, because here's a 13-year-old girl who at least knows enough about this war going on that when she has this vision, she's just like, all right, yeah, like it's my job now to pop in and go and win this war. And it didn't necessarily have to be a 13-year-old girl. It could have been some 16-year-old boy, some 19-year-old boy who has the vision like, I'm supposed to win this war now. War is just such an innate part of their lives at the time that it's a great look into the dynamic of the period and how the people of these nations saw themselves.
I think she's so incredible because she doesn't have any right. And she's nobody. Yeah. Like, I love that. I was expecting you to say that she was some daughter of some nobleman somewhere who was like, he was on some camp, he was a knight and he was, whatever. And
she studied military theory since she could walk.
Yeah. And like, she's nobody. And to me, it's such a cool story in lack of limitation. I also think, in American history, we study people like Molly Pitcher and, or fictitious or real or whatever the debate is over her, and other women in early wars in American history that we don't have context to. And Joan is a great, like Molly Pitcher didn't come out of nowhere. Women were like, you know what, I'm going to operate a cannon today. Like they've been doing that in war for as far back as we can go. And here's a good one to show, at least in recent history.
And odds are, if you ask the average person to like envision a woman warrior, they're going to envision some version of Joan. And because she is the first one that comes to our minds. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that she managed to openly be a woman that was fighting. And she is not the first or the last. Like we've already said before, there were Celtic women, Scandinavian women, really from all around the world throughout history. We have seen women fighting. We have seen them even leading and fighting. Boudica led the Britons against the Romans. Shang-Chi ends up creating the most powerful pirate confederacy of all time. If you look back at like the war in Troy, the Trojan War, which may not have actually ever happened at all. But, like the stories around it, the Amazons come into that. So like we always have this fascination with female warriors. And Joan was one of the first ones in sort of our more modern recognition of history that got to live as that open female warrior. But most that come after her don't. They have to disguise their identity to fight. And there are tens of thousands of women who fought in wars after Joan. And in many ways, Joan sort of became the lesson in being a woman in war, like openly being a woman in war. So most of them have had to take on the identity of a man.
Yeah, covert.
So, right. So, Scottish and Irish women fought against the English. Deborah Sampson in the American Revolution took on the identity of a man. She got a soldier's pension after the war. Jenny Hodgers and 400 women fought in the Civil War that we can catalog dressed as men. So many more came. It's just, in many ways, Joan became sort of the lesson in being the female soldier.
Yeah. That's so cool. And she got away with it. And I love it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for teaching me this important history. It's so awesome to have you here and to have my colleague down the hall sharing in this venture. So thank you.
Absolutely. Loved it.
Thanks so much for listening to Remedial Herstory, the other 50%. Please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to your podcasts to bring more voices to the conversation. We really appreciate that effort. Until next time.